Vilataris hummed softly as her slender blue fingers danced across the navigation console of her research vessel. The stars streamed past the viewport, their light catching in the silver markings that adorned her skin, birthmarks that designated her as a respected scientist among her people, the Asterians. "Proximity alert," chimed the ship's AI. "Approaching territorial boundary." Vila nodded, her four eyes, two large primary ones of deep violet and two smaller secondary ones above, scanning the readings. The crystalline particles she'd been tracking for her xenobiology research were drifting awfully close to draconian space. She'd have to be careful. "Plot a course parallel to the boundary," she instructed. "Maintain a safe distance of at least 50 kilometers." Her home government, the Asterian Coalition, had strict protocols about proximity to draconian territory. The peace between their species was fragile at best, a cold war that had simmered for generations. One wrong move could spark an incident. Vila had no interest in politics. Her passion was understanding the strange crystalline organisms that seemed to migrate between star systems, carrying unique genetic information. The ship shuddered unexpectedly. "Warning, navigation system malfunction," the AI announced, its voice unnervingly calm. "Gravitational anomaly detected." Vila's heart raced as she watched the boundary line on her display grow closer. "Engage emergency thrusters, reverse course." Her fingers flew across the controls, but the ship continued its drift toward the invisible line that separated safety from danger. The crystalline particles she'd been studying were creating some kind of interference field, something her instruments hadn't detected until now. "Come on," she whispered, feeling sweat beading on her forehead ridges. "Please work." The emergency thrusters sputtered to life, but too late. Her vessel crossed the boundary, and immediately warning signals blazed across her console. In the distance, she saw them, the sleek, predatory shapes of draconian patrol vessels, their hulls gleaming like obsidian scales in the starlight. They'd been waiting, watching, as if they'd known she would cross. Vila opened an emergency channel. "Attention draconian vessels, this is research scientist Vila Taurus of the Asterian Coalition. My navigation system has malfunctioned. I apologize for the boundary violation and am attempting to retreat immediately." Only static answered. Then a harsh voice cut through. "Asterian vessel, you have violated draconian sovereign space. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded." "There's been a mistake," Vila pleaded. "I'm conducting peaceful research." A warning shot sliced past her ship, close enough to make the hull resonate. "Next one won't miss," the voice stated flatly. Vila's secondary eyes closed in resignation as she powered down her engines. Within minutes, armored draconians boarded her vessel, tall reptilian figures with scaled skin and eyes that glowed amber in the dim emergency lighting of her ship. "Scientist Vila Taurus," the commander said, consulting a data pad, "you are charged with espionage against the Draconian Empire." "Espionage? I'm a biologist. This was an accident." The back of his armored hand connected with her face, snapping her head to the side. "Silence! Your research vessel crossed into restricted space near our military testing grounds. Your scientific equipment has been scanning our defenses." Blood trickled from her lip as realization dawned. She'd been set up. The crystalline particles had been deliberately released near the boundary, likely by draconian operatives, to lure curious Asterian scientists. As they dragged her from her ship, Vila managed to activate her emergency beacon. Surely her government would intervene once they realized what had happened. She couldn't have known that within hours, the Asterian Coalition would receive a formal complaint from the Draconian Empire, accusing them of sanctioning espionage. And in the name of maintaining fragile peace, her own people would disavow all knowledge of her mission, declaring her a rogue agent who had acted without authorization. By nightfall, as Vila was processed in a detention center on a barren draconian moon, her name was being systematically erased from Asterian records. The last thing taken from her was her scientist's medallion, the symbol of her life's work and identity. "Prisoner 7294, the processing officer declared, replacing her name with a number. "Take her to the eastern compound." As she was led away, Vila looked to the stars one last time, not knowing it would be years before she saw them again. 3 years, 1,092 cycles of waking to the same harsh buzzer, the same gray walls, the same crushing routine. Prisoner 7294, once known as Vila Taris, no longer flinched when the guards passed. Her 4 eyes, once bright with curiosity, remained downcast, the smaller secondary pair now permanently half-closed from malnutrition. The silver markings on her blue skin had dulled to ashen streaks, no longer catching the light as they once had among the stars. "Move 7294? A guard's electrified prod jabbed between her shoulder blades, sending her stumbling forward into the mining tunnel. The air here was thick with toxic particles that slowly poisoned the prisoner's lungs. The Draconians provided respirators that filtered just enough to keep their laborers alive, but not enough to prevent the chronic cough that had become Vila's constant companion. She took her position at the crystalline seam, picking up the laser drill. Her once delicate hands, trained to manipulate sensitive scientific instruments, were now calloused and scarred. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now mined the same type of crystals she had once studied with such passion. "Production quota increased today," announced the overseer, a particularly cruel Draconian named Commander Krex. "Anyone who fails to meet it forfeits their evening ration." Murmurs of despair rippled through the line of prisoners, a diverse collection of species from across the galaxy, all accused of various crimes against the Draconian Empire. Most, Vila suspected, were innocent like her, political pawns in a galactic chess game they never asked to play. Hours blurred together as Vila worked methodically, her muscles screaming with fatigue. She no longer spoke. None of the long-term prisoners did. Their voices had been beaten out of them in the first year. Communication happened through subtle gestures, blinks, and occasionally, when guards weren't watching, touch. "Thinking about escape again, 7294? Whispered a guard who had crept up behind her. This one, Officer Turs, took particular pleasure in tormenting her. "Still waiting for your precious coalition to come save you." Vila kept her eyes on her work, giving no indication she'd heard him. "They've forgotten you exist," he hissed, leaning closer. "Want to know a secret? I processed the official communication myself. The Asterians denied any knowledge of your mission, called you a traitor, a renegade." He laughed, the sound like gravel. "No one's coming for you. No one even remembers you." She'd heard this before. It was Turs's favorite taunt. But each time the words cut deeper because she knew they were true. In the first months, she'd clung to hope, certain her colleagues, her friends, her government would demand her release. She'd imagined diplomatic envoys arriving, providing evidence of her innocence, taking her home. But no one had come. At night in the cramped barracks where 40 prisoners slept on hard platforms designed for 30, Vila lay awake looking through a narrow slit in the wall. It wasn't a window. The Draconians wouldn't grant such a luxury, just a structural flaw that offered a glimpse of sky. Through it, she could sometimes see a star or two. "Are you watching tonight?" came a whisper from the platform beside hers. It was prisoner 8103, a small, rodent-like being with delicate features who had arrived 6 months ago. Unlike most, 8103 still spoke occasionally, not yet broken by the camp's cruelty. They had become Vila's only friend, though friend seemed too strong a word for the guarded relationship prisoners allowed themselves. Vila nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on a particularly bright star visible through the crack. "I heard things," 8103 continued, voice barely audible. "Whispers among the guards. Someone's been asking questions about this place, about prisoners who don't officially exist." Vila turned, meeting 8103's gaze. She'd learned to be wary of hope. It was crueler than despair. "An outsider," 8103 added. "Not Draconian, not Asterian either, maybe human." Humans, Vila had encountered a few in her scientific career. Their species was relatively new to interstellar travel, politically neutral in the Cold War between major powers. They had a reputation for curiosity, and for not always respecting the boundaries other species established. Vila turned away. It didn't matter. Even if some human was asking questions, it wouldn't change anything. The Draconians would never admit to holding political prisoners, and no single person could stand against an empire. As she drifted into fitful sleep, Vila dreamed of stars for the first time in years. But in her dream, they were going out, one by one, until only darkness remained. She didn't yet know that across the sector, a human diplomatic courier named Ethan Mercer was staring at her file, a file that officially didn't exist, and making a decision that would change both their lives forever. Ethan Mercer slouched in the corner of the diplomatic lounge on Outpost Kappa 7, nursing a drink while pretending to review files on his data pad. In reality, he was eavesdropping on the draconian officials 3 tables away, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments of conversation. "Prisoner transfer from the Nexus facility," one was saying, mandibles clicking with agitation. "Dangerous to move her now," replied another. "Been there too long." Ethan sipped his drink slowly. As a human diplomatic courier, he occupied a unique position in the complex web of interstellar politics. Earth maintained strict neutrality in the Cold War between the Draconian Empire and the Asterian Coalition, making humans useful intermediaries for sensitive communications. It also meant Ethan could move between territories that would be forbidden to others. And he heard things, many things. For 6 months, he'd been tracking whispers of a secret detention facility where the Draconians kept prisoners who officially didn't exist. Not typical criminals or prisoners of war, those were acknowledged and processed according to interstellar conventions. These were different, vanished people, erased from records. "Mr. Mercer," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Ethan looked up to see Ambassador Drell, his current employer, standing over him. The Centaurian diplomat adjusted his formal robes nervously. "Your credentials, please. I need to send this diplomatic packet to the Regency immediately." Ethan handed over his clearance chip, maintaining his carefully cultivated image of bored indifference. At 34, with perpetually tousled dark hair and a 3-day stubble he kept precisely trimmed to look careless, most officials dismissed him as just another human mercenary doing jobs for credits. They didn't notice his sharp green eyes that missed nothing, or how he could recall conversations verbatim months later. "Will that be all, Ambassador?" Ethan asked, retrieving his chip. Yes, Drell said distractedly. "Return tomorrow for the response." Alone again, Ethan activated his secure personal encryption and opened the file he'd been building. It contained fragments of information collected over months, coordinates possibly identifying the secret facility, guard rotation schedules, and most importantly, a list of non-existent prisoners. One name had appeared repeatedly in his intelligence gathering: prisoner 7294, female, Asterian, captured 3 years ago on espionage charges, officially disavowed by her government. Something about this prisoner had caught Ethan's attention. The timeline of her disappearance coincided with a sudden cooling of relations between the empires. The official story, that she was a rogue agent, contradicted intelligence suggesting she'd been a respected scientist. Ethan had always had an inconvenient sense of justice. His mother called it stubbornness. His father called it a death wish. Whatever it was, it had prevented him from thriving in Earth's diplomatic corps and sent him freelancing across the stars instead. Back in his small quarters, Ethan accessed the outpost's communication array using an encryption key he definitely wasn't supposed to have. He uploaded the data packet to his contact, an information broker on Vega Prime who owed him a favor. The response came faster than expected. "Found your ghost," read the message. "Scientist, xenobiologist, specialized in migratory crystalline organisms. All records purged from Asterian databases 3 standard years ago, but I found mentions in academic journals predating her disappearance. Vila Taurus, highly respected. No history of political activity." Attached was a grainy image, an Asterian female with distinctive silver markings on her blue skin and 4 expressive eyes. She looked directly at the camera, radiating intelligence and quiet confidence. Ethan stared at the image, a strange tightness gripping his chest. This was no spy. This was a scientist who'd stumbled into something or been deliberately set up. His comm unit chimed with a new assignment. The Draconian diplomatic office needed sensitive documents delivered to a military installation. The coordinates made his pulse jump. It was within 50 kilometers of the suspected detention facility. Opportunity had just knocked. Now he had to decide if he was foolish enough to answer. Ethan wasn't naive. Interfering with Draconian internal affairs could trigger an interstellar incident. Best case scenario, he'd lose his courier credentials. Worst case, he'd disappear into the same black hole as Vila Taurus. Yet as he packed his diplomatic case the next morning, he found himself adding items not on any official manifest. A multi-tool disguised as a stylus, a data spike that could breach low-level security systems, and identification chips that could be reprogrammed in a pinch. He couldn't explain his motivation, even to himself. Perhaps it was the injustice. Perhaps it was the nagging certainty that something larger was at play. Or perhaps it was those four eyes in the photograph, eyes that had once looked at stars with wonder before they were locked away in darkness. As he boarded the transport to draconian space, Ethan made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. He was going to find prisoner 7294. He was going to learn the truth. And if the truth was what he suspected, he was going to get her out or die trying. The inspection badge on Ethan's chest felt heavier than it should, its counterfeit nature seeming to pulse with each beat of his heart. He maintained a brisk pace through the detention facility's corridors, datapad in hand, nodding curtly to passing guards as if he belonged there. 3 days of preparation had led to this moment. After delivering the diplomatic documents to the military installation, he'd claimed mechanical trouble with his ship, a problem he'd created himself, giving him time to prepare his infiltration. Sector inspection, he stated coldly to the guard at the mining section checkpoint, channeling the arrogance of draconian officials he'd observed over the years. Imperial Command has concerns about production efficiency. The guard, a younger draconian whose scales hadn't yet darkened with age, hesitated. I don't recall any scheduled inspection. That's rather the point of a surprise inspection, isn't it? Ethan replied, letting impatience color his tone as he held out his forged credentials. Unless you'd prefer I report your obstruction to Commander Krex. The name drop worked. The guard's inner eyelids flickered nervously as he waved Ethan through without scanning the badge. Typical hierarchical weakness. No one wanted to risk questioning someone who might have authority. Inside the mining sector, the conditions were worse than Ethan had imagined. The air was thick with crystalline dust that made his lungs burn despite his filtration mask. Prisoners of various species worked the extraction lines, their movements mechanical, eyes vacant. Many showed signs of malnourishment and abuse, sunken features, visible injuries, trembling limbs. Ethan consulted his datapad, which displayed the facility layout he'd pieced together from stolen security protocols. Section E7 was where prisoner 7294 would likely be located. As he moved deeper into the facility, the weight of what he was attempting pressed upon him. One wrong move, one suspicious guard, and he'd never leave this place. He found her in the furthest tunnel, separated from other workers. Even prepared as he was, the sight stopped him cold. The vibrant blue female from the photograph was now a pallid gray blue, her once distinctive silver markings faded to dull smudges. She was gaunt, her frame diminished, working methodically at a crystal seam with a laser drill that looked too heavy for her wasted muscles. But it was her eyes, those four expressive eyes, that struck him hardest. The smaller upper pair were nearly closed, and all were dulled, focused on nothing but the task before her. Ethan approached slowly, aware of the security cameras tracking movement. He positioned himself to block their view. Prisoner 7294, he said loudly for the benefit of any listening devices. Then much softer, Velataris. She didn't react to her name, didn't look up. I need to inspect your workstation, he continued officially, then whispered. I know who you are, I'm here to help you. Now she glanced up, and Ethan saw a flash of something in those eyes, not hope but wariness. She'd learned that hope was dangerous. Follow my lead, he murmured, pretending to examine her drill. Tonight, third shift change, be ready. A slight dip of her head was the only acknowledgement. She had spoken no words, made no obvious response, yet Ethan sensed she understood. He completed his inspection, making notes and looking appropriately displeased for the cameras, then moved on to other sections to avoid suspicion. His mind raced with the next steps of his plan. The night cycle brought the facility to its lowest staffing levels. Ethan, having completed his inspection, had arranged guest quarters near the administrative section, strategically close to both the security hub and the rarely used maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the facility. At precisely 02:17 local time, the third shift change began. Using the access codes he'd stolen, Ethan triggered a minor environmental alert in Section C, far from both Vila's location and his planned escape route. As guards diverted to investigate, he slipped through maintenance access points, disabling security feeds as he went. When he reached the prisoner barracks, he found her waiting, silent and still as stone, her few possessions, a thin blanket and a small carved stone, clutched in her hands. Can you run? He whispered. She nodded once. Stay close. They moved through the darkened corridors, Ethan leading them through the path he'd memorized. Twice they had to hide, once from a patrol, once from a maintenance worker. Each time, Vila moved with surprising stealth for someone so weakened. They had nearly reached the maintenance tunnel that would lead them to the landing pads when alarm klaxons split the night. Harsh red lighting flooded the corridor. Intruder alert. Security breach in Sector E. All personnel to containment positions. Run, Ethan hissed, grabbing Vila's thin wrist. They sprinted down the corridor, no longer concerned with stealth. Behind them, the heavy footfalls of Draconian guards echoed. As they rounded the corner to the maintenance access, they found it blocked by Commander Krex himself, flanked by 2 guards with raised weapons. "Inspection's over, human," Krex said, mandibles flaring in what passed for a smile among his kind. "You've taken something that belongs to the Empire." Ethan pushed Vila behind him, mind racing through options, finding none. "She doesn't belong to anyone," he said finally. "She's a scientist who was wrongfully imprisoned." "She's a spy who violated our territory," Krex countered. "And you're a human diplomatic courier named Ethan Mercer with no authority to conduct inspections." His scaled hand tightened on his weapon. "Interfering with Draconian security operations is an act of war. Your government will disavow you just as hers did her." More guards appeared behind them, cutting off retreat. "The difference," Ethan said quietly, "is that I knew that when I came." It happened in an instant. Ethan lunged, not at Krex, but at the wall panel beside him, smashing his counterfeit badge against it. The security chip inside connected with the facility's systems, triggering the emergency protocol he'd programmed as a last resort. Darkness fell as power to the entire section cut out. Emergency locks disengaged. In the chaos that followed, Ethan felt Vila's hand grasp his, pulling him not toward the maintenance tunnel, but down another corridor he hadn't planned. Somehow, she moved confidently in the darkness, leading them through passages he hadn't known existed. Behind them, shouts and confusion. Ahead, uncertainty. But for the first time since entering the facility, Ethan felt something unexpected. Hope. The stolen Draconian shuttle shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, systems straining after 3 consecutive jumps. Ethan's fingers danced across the unfamiliar controls, coaxing the vessel toward the small moon that hung like a jewel against the gas giant's swirling surface. "Sanctuary outpost," he murmured. "Independent trading station, no extradition agreements with either empire." Beside him in the co-pilot's seat, Vila watched the approaching moon with all 4 eyes fully open, the first time Ethan had seen her that way. The past week had been a blur of desperate flight, narrow escapes, and tense silences broken only by necessary communication. She hadn't spoken a single word since their escape. Not when they'd stolen the shuttle in the chaos of the prison break. Not when they'd outrun the Draconian patrol vessels. Not even when Ethan had treated her injuries in the cramped medical bay, his fingers gentle against her bruised skin. But something had changed between them, a trust born of shared danger and unspoken understanding. When he slept, she watched over him. When she trembled with nightmares, he sat beside her, not touching, just present until the terror passed. The shuttle's comm crackled. "Unidentified vessel, identify yourself and state your purpose." Ethan opened a channel. "Trading vessel Sierra Mist requesting docking for repairs and resupply." He transmitted the false identification codes he'd programmed into the shuttle's transponder. A pause, then. "Proceed to docking bay 12, Sierra Mist. Entry fee is 200 credits. As Ethan guided the shuttle into the bustling station, he glanced at Vila. "We should be safe here for a while. I have contacts who can get us new identities, passage to the Outer Rim territories." She nodded then, to his surprise, reached out to touch his hand. Her fingers were cool against his skin, the gentle pressure conveying gratitude when words failed. Their quarters in the station's residential sector were modest but private, a small 2-room suite with basic amenities. For Vila, even these simple comforts seemed overwhelming after years of imprisonment. She stood in the sonic shower for nearly an hour, then examined the soft bed linens with something like wonder. That night, as they ate a simple meal of synthesized protein and fresh fruits, a luxury Vila approached with reverence, Ethan shared what he'd learned. "Your capture wasn't accidental," he explained, spreading out data files on the small table. "The crystalline organisms you were studying, they were deliberately placed near the border as bait. The Draconians needed a bargaining chip, someone they could accuse of espionage to justify increased militarization of the border regions. Vila listened, her food forgotten. Your government knew you were innocent, he continued grimly. But acknowledging that would have meant admitting the Draconians had set a trap, which would have escalated tensions. It was politically expedient to disavow you. Her shoulders slumped, the betrayal still fresh despite the years. But, Ethan added, pulling out a small data crystal, I have proof. All of it, the orders to set the trap, the communications between governments, your original research data proving your intentions were scientific. Enough to clear your name and expose both empires' deceptions. For the first time, Vila's hand moved to her throat, a gesture Ethan had come to recognize as her struggling to find her voice. When she finally spoke, her words were hoarse from disuse, barely above a whisper. Why, the single word carried the weight of all her suffering. Why had he risked everything for her? Why had he cared when her own people hadn't? Ethan considered the question seriously, searching for an answer that would make sense. Because it was wrong, he said finally. Because when I learned about you, I couldn't just look away. He shrugged, embarrassed by his own idealism. Humans have a bad habit of interfering where we don't belong. A sound escaped her, soft, rusty. It took him a moment to realize she was laughing. That night they talked, or rather, Ethan talked while Vila listened, occasionally offering whispered responses as her voice gradually strengthened. He told her about Earth, about his childhood in New Seattle, about his short-lived career in the diplomatic corps before his inconvenient sense of justice had derailed it. In the days that followed, their routine took shape. Ethan would venture into the station to gather supplies and information while Vila remained hidden in their quarters, slowly regaining her strength. Each evening, they would share what they had learned, planning their next move. On the seventh night, everything changed. Ethan returned to their quarters to find Vila standing by the viewport, her posture tense. They found us, she said, her voice stronger now. Draconian agents, I sensed them searching the lower levels. Before Ethan could question how she knew this, the station's public address system crackled. Attention all residents. This station is now under temporary lockdown by order of Draconian security forces. All citizens must remain in quarters for identity verification. Ethan's mind raced. We need to move. There's a smuggler's ship leaving for the Outer Rim in 2 hours. No, Vila turned to face him fully. In the dim light, her silver markings seemed to shimmer with new intensity. I'm tired of running, of hiding. She stepped closer, her 4 eyes meeting his 2. You saved me, Ethan. You gave me back my voice, my name. Her slender hand rose to touch his cheek. But I need to reclaim my truth. The touch ignited something between them, a current that had been building since the moment he'd first spoken her name in that dark mine. Without thinking, Ethan leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against hers in an intimacy that transcended species. Whatever you decide, he whispered, I'm with you. Her eyes closed, and suddenly Ethan felt a presence in his mind, gentle, questioning. Telepathic abilities were rare but not unknown among Asterians, though Vila had never mentioned having this gift. Trust me, her voice whispered in his thoughts. When the Draconian agents broke through their door an hour later, they found Ethan and Vila waiting calmly. But before the soldiers could speak, Vila raised her hands, her markings pulsing with light. A wave of telepathic energy flowed from her, connecting not just with the Draconians but with every mind in the station. Through this link, she shared everything, her innocence, her imprisonment, the political machinations that had stolen 3 years of her life. Not as dry facts, but as lived experience, complete with every emotion. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The Draconian agents faltered, their weapons lowering as they experienced firsthand the injustice they had participated in. How, Ethan gasped when it was over, as the agents retreated in confusion. My people have latent telepathic abilities, Vila explained. Mine were minimal before, useful only for communicating with the crystalline organisms I studied, but in prison, in silence, they grew stronger. Her eyes met his, and something about connecting with you amplified them. Within hours, the station was in uproar. The telepathic broadcast had reached thousands, who shared it with thousands more. The evidence Ethan had gathered spread across networks faster than either government could suppress it. 3 months later, they stood together on the observation deck of a neutral diplomatic vessel. watching representatives from both empires sign the first meaningful peace accord in generations. "They're calling it the Taurus Protocols," Ethan said, shaking his head in wonder. "How does it feel to have an interstellar peace agreement named after you?" Vila's fingers intertwined with his, her markings glowing softly in response to his proximity, a reaction Ethan had come to treasure. "It feels like purpose," she answered, "like all that suffering led to something greater." She turned to face him fully, four eyes meeting his with an intensity that still made his heart race. "But it's not what I treasure most from this journey." As her lips met his, Ethan reflected that some boundaries were meant to be crossed, some rules broken. And sometimes what waited on the other side wasn't war or chaos, but understanding, connection, love. Across the stars, two empires began the slow work of building trust. And in a quiet corner of the galaxy, an alien woman and a human man discovered that the distance between worlds was nothing compared to the distance they'd already crossed to find each other.